Old school UFC, the most vicious and bloody time in MMA. The first UFC tournaments were real no-holds-barred fights. Fights where steroid mutants and pub brawlers met in the cage, where the noise of the crowd resembled the roar of wild beasts, and where fighters could fight for half an hour without a break. This was an era when the UFC looked more like an underground berserkers club than a sports organization. Watching today's fighters refusing fights and contracts where they are being paid more than $1 million makes us want to get back to the past, where fighters were fighting with whoever, however principle. And the prize for health damage and injuries was a case of beer. Some of these fights, of course, I'm hyperbolizing, having nostalgic flashbacks. At the first UFC tournaments, fighters fought without gloves and had to observe only 2 rules: not to bite the opponent and not to press on his eyes. Everything else was allowed, but tacitly condemned by most fighters, who out of corporate solidarity rarely resorted to dirty tricks. There were exceptions, though. The American Keith Hackney remembered by the audience that, being in the mat, he suddenly started to beat his opponent in the groin. It hurt any man to watch, but the South Korean fighter Joe Son withstood the blows and quietly continued the fight. By the way, Son is currently serving a life sentence in prison for gang rape. Traditionally, each tournament featured 8 fighters, who started their journey to the title from the quarterfinals. The peculiarity of the early UFC was that the tournament lasted one night, and fighters had several fights in a row, often with no time to rest. The record holder in this regard is Brazilian Royce Gracie, who had 4 fights in an evening at UFC 2. In today's reality, when fighters spend half a year preparing for one fight, it seems fantastic. Another feature of the first UFC tournaments was the lack of division of fights won by TKO in the first minute of the fight. The audience of that time loved such fights. UFC once held a special David vs. Goliath tournament, where athletes of different sizes faced each other. The first tournament in UFC history took place in 1993 in Denver. 8 fighters participated, and each represented a particular martial arts school: boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, taekwondo, and even sumo. The goal of the organizers was to find out which fighting school was cooler. Royce Gracie was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter, and despite his modest size, won that tournament. All his victories he won by submissions, because at that time most fighters had poor wrestling techniques and were defenseless against the Brazilian. Later on, Gracie managed to repeat his success twice more, at UFC 2 and UFC 4. However, in 1995, the 3-time champion unexpectedly quit, explaining that he did not agree with the UFC's direction. But evil tongues said that Gracie was simply scared of the growing competition. Whatever the case, Gracie did not manage to go undefeated. In 2006, he returned to UFC 60 and ruined his record by losing by TKO to Matt Hughes. By 1995, the UFC had managed to hold 4 tournaments, which revealed serious problems in the organization of the fights. UFC 5 was the field for the first experiments. First, the organizers introduced a 30-minute fight limit. In the first tournaments, there was no time limit and the fight would end with a knockout, or with one of the fighters giving up. UFC 3 also introduced the possibility of technical stoppage of the fight by the referee. Before that, only his team could save the fighter by throwing a white towel into the octagon. Secondly, the organizers introduced title fights for the UFC Championship belt. The reason for that was UFC 3, which was won by Steve Jenham, unknown to the public, who replaced the injured Royce Gracie in the semifinals. Jenham won and made it to the finals, where he was to face Ken Shamrock, who withdrew due to injury. This is how an ordinary Nebraska police officer became the first UFC champion who had only one fight. The new rules established a kind of dual power. Along with the champion of the tournament, the title champion appeared. Despite the fact that in the history both of them remained UFC champions, the attitude towards tournament champions was more skeptical, and soon the tournament format was cancelled altogether. Russian fans will remember UFC 5 for the appearance in the octagon of Oleg Taktarov, a Sambo wrestler, who reached the semifinals of the tournament where he lost to American Greco-Roman wrestler Dan Severn. Severn fought in an unusual style of wrestling, actively using pokes with his open hand instead of punches, and could knock an opponent to the ground with a slap. In the semi-final with Taktarov, he inflicted a split decision on the Russian, due to which the referee stopped the fight and declared the American as the winner. Taktarov didn't agree to stop the fight, but that didn't stop Severn from advancing to the finals and winning, becoming the UFC 5 champion. However, 2 months later at UFC 6, Taktarov had an opportunity for a rematch. Severn faced Shamrock in a title fight, so the only opponent for the Russian Bear was puncher David Tank Abbott. The American became the public favorite since his first appearance in the octagon, professing the street fighting style. He made each of his fights a meat grinder, reminiscent of a drunken bar brawl. And so it happened. The fighters met in the finals, where they had a real meat brawl. Abbott dominated most of the fight, landing many accurate punches on Taktarov. However, Tank's vulnerable side has always been his physical preparation. He was overweight and quickly exhausted, which Taktarov took advantage of. Waiting for the American to tire, Taktarov dumped him on the ground and won on the 17th minute of the fight by a choke. Thus, the Russian became the UFC champion for the first time. Thanks to his victory in the tournament, Taktarov got a chance at a title fight, but his fight with Ken Shamrock at UFC 7 in 1995 ended in a draw, and the UFC champion title was retained by the American. That same year, Taktarov took part in another tournament and reached the finals, but lost there again to Dan Severn. That was Taktarov's last fight in the UFC, after which he left for Japan Seas. Taktarov's departure coincided with the arrival of the True Titans who, along with Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn, made up the first wave of top UFC appearance at UFC 8. Harry was a successful arm wrestler and also took part in boxing competitions. But in the UFC, he represented the exotic Korean school Kook Sol-won, performing in the octagon in a black kimono. Subsequently, it turned out that Goodridge did not have a black belt, but simply agreed to represent a little-known school in order to promote it in the West. Unlike Goodridge, Don Fry was a more powerful fighter. As a professional boxer, he also competed in wrestling as a young man, where he was mentored by the already UFC famous Dan Severn. In the finals, the fighters had an exemplary showdown, with Fry coming out victorious, becoming the UFC champion for the first time. The brutal bare-knuckle fights taking place on US soil inevitably attracted attention and generated public controversy. And if for a while, the dissatisfaction with fights was local in nature, then when it reached the conservative political circles, it threatened the existence of the UFC. Senator John McCain, who received the tape of the tournaments, announced a full-scale campaign against illegal fights. He called the UFC human cockfighting and sent letters to all state governments asking them to ban it. The open legal battle, as well as the blown contracts for the broadcast of the upcoming tournament, forced the UFC organizers to make concessions. This led to UFC 9 being remembered by fans as one of the worst tournaments in history. To reduce the degree of cruelty in the octagon, the organizers have banned fighters to hit with fists under the threat of monetary fines. At the same time, the new rules were not announced in advance, and the audience saw a strange spectacle, where huge fighters were beating each other with palms of their hands. The title fight between Ken Shamrock and Dan Northern lasted half an hour and did not decide the winner. After the judges declared Severn the winner, glasses of beer flew into the octagon. Subsequently, McCain was accused of being bribed by boxing promoters, who were unhappy with the growing popularity of the UFC, but he denied everything. The senator's activities eventually bore fruit. In a few years, the UFC would finally transform from a bloody spectacle into a violent sport, but at least a sport. UFC, The Ultimate 2, took place in 1996 and was the last breath of the meat era of the UFC. The organizers, as if anticipating the coming changes, decided to please the audience with a tournament where all the stars of that time met. Ken Shamrock, Don Frye, Gary Goodridge, Tank Abbott, and also Mark Coleman, who had previously won UFC 10 and UFC 11. Trouble began when organizers learned that Mark Coleman, the biggest star of recent years, was withdrawing from the tournament due to illness. At the semifinal stage, Ken Shamrock also got injured, and his place was taken by the little-known Steve Nelmark, which considerably weakened the competition for the title. The biggest draw at the time was the semifinal bout between Don Frye and Mark Hall. Mark Hall, who by that time had already lost twice to Frye, had virtually no chance of winning. But the way he lost caused many to suspect that the fight was scripted. Hall gave up within 12 seconds of the start of the fight, leaving the audience questioned. Frye had a tough quarterfinal, and many suspected that Hall, who had the same manager as Frye, had decided to give in to his comrade to give him a rest. Despite the scandal, Frye was allowed to reach the finals, where he defeated Tank Abbott to become the UFC champion again. After that, Frye left the UFC and went to Japanese wrestling. In the following years, the UFC began to change and to be filled with numerous roles. At UFC 12, fighters were divided into weight classes, and at UFC 14, gloves became mandatory. Kicking, hair pulling, pinching the cheek, head kicks, and groin kicks were banned. At UFC 15, punches to the back of the head, neck, and back, as well as minor joint manipulation, were banned. At UFC 21, bouts were divided into 5-minute rounds, after which the UFC finally became a sport. The reforms made led to the incredible media success of the UFC. The fights became less violent, and over time, everyone from fitness instructors to office plankton began to watch them. After the UFC women's division appeared, even the weaker half of mankind became interested in the fights. All this led to the fact that today's fighters look more like royalty than brutal berserkers. Their health is monitored by hundreds of specialists, and the medical board can take them off the fight for a minor bruise. Nevertheless, the first UFC tournaments will always be legendary in the hearts of the fans, because they were not a sport, but a real bloody entertainment. But, unfortunately, the 21st century did not accept the titans of the past. Almost all of them did not fit into the new times. Gary Goodridge became disabled because of the fights and said he wanted to kill himself. Don Frye survived a coma and went on a binge after divorcing his wife. And Mark Coleman is selling his awards on eBay. These days, attempts are being made to recreate the format of bare-knuckle fighting, but it will never be the same. All that remains is for us to search the vast expanses of the internet for footage of the first tournaments, and enjoy again how the mustachioed fireman Don Frye first enters the octagon, and the huge steroid Ken Shamrock breaks his opponents with a sprawling takedown. Archival videos from an era that the current UFC organizers so loathe to remember give us a glimpse of the animal hatred that was once in the air at UFC tournaments to this day.